There's a lot of speculation around Elon Musk and Twitter right now, and people are saying possibly that Elon wants to rethink Twitter and make it a Web3 type of application for folks to use. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Well, I think generally, this is a good effort towards free speech. I think freedom in all forms is worth defending, and crypto is a lot of it is about economic freedom, so freedom of speech is another version. I do think there's an opportunity for Twitter to essentially embrace using a decentralized protocol. And just in the way that you've probably heard of DeFi, which is decentralized finance, there's another one called DSO, decentralized social media, which is another emerging area coming up. So a lot of teams are actually out there now looking at, can we make a decentralized protocol for social media where it doesn't mean some company owns my identity and all the content and all the likes and the follower graphs. Maybe I can own my own identity, a decentralized identity, and when I post something, it can be stored in IPFS or Filecoin in a decentralized ledger, and anybody could make a client to consume all of this information out there and display it to the user in various ways. And by the way, they could each have their own kind of content moderation policy, but the data, the identity, the follower graphs has all become a public good, essentially. It's democratized access to that. And I think that's one of the directions Twitter could go. I imagine that there's a number of startups and other companies that will be building competing decentralized social media products.
Cathie mentioned next generation internet, right? One of the buzzwords we hear is Web3. We also hear metaverse, NFTs, all these buzzwords. Can you kind of break that down and sort of how you think about these?
Yeah, sure. So I think of Web 1 as really being about read only. So people were trying to put magazines and newspapers kind of published on the internet and you would just read those. In Web 2, of course, with JavaScript and some of these technologies, we got more interactive web applications like Gmail or Google Maps, and we were able to do read and write. You could kind of interact with these applications. So Web 3 is really about read, write, and own. So you can now not only read and write, you can actually own a piece of these applications or these networks that are being created. And actually, I think Web 3, similar to Cathie, is going to be this foundation that a lot of the future applications built on the internet are all going to be built on Web 3. A lot of startups that are getting funded today, they'll have some crypto angle to it. They're either using that to build their initial community, the actual content is put on the blockchain, they're using it to raise money, they're using it to accept payments globally. So it's kind of like, you used to say, well, this is a .com startup. You don't have to say .com anymore because every startup is using the internet. And I think that's what's happening with startups now. Every one of them is starting to use crypto. Okay, so Web3 also I think is going to be a great foundational piece of technology for the metaverse, because of course in the metaverse you have this persistent world. You want to be able to own the digital items in that, and that's one of the things people are calling NFTs, non-fungible tokens. They're basically a way to digitally own an item that is provably unique. I know I have a copy of it, but nobody else can have the same copy of the same thing. And so NFTs have taken off in a really big way. They're useful in the metaverse. They're also useful for artwork, but they're useful for a lot more than that. You can think of many use cases for someone having a provably unique digital item. It could be, the event passes to enter an event like the one that we came to today. You could think of musicians publishing their music in this digital way. You could think of identity and login and domain names and gaming. There's so many different items there. So I do think NFTs are going to be one of these other big foundational technologies, and it's pretty exciting to see so many different things coming out of one area called crypto. I think one of the common misconceptions I see is people, when I talk to them about crypto, they sometimes think, well, that's like Bitcoin, it's sort of an asset class. Well, yes, that's true, but there's not just going to be commodities like Bitcoin and Ethereum. There's going to be securities in crypto. There's going to be currencies like stable coins. There's going to be artwork and things that are not even financial services regulated at all, decentralized identity and new forms of governance. So it turns out this is probably the most exciting area, certainly happening in financial services, but probably in technology broadly. This is one of the most important areas of innovation.
Crypto is a force for good, right? So there's some estimates that $200 million in donations have been sent to the people of Ukraine to help preserve democracy there. How do you see crypto helping people in the future?
Yeah, so that was a really exciting moment to see Ukraine reach out to the world for donations and receive that $200 million. I think a lot of donations were tiny amounts, $100. And I think that was the first time we've seen a government somewhere in the world actually ask for money in cryptocurrency. We've also seen, by the way, some smaller countries adopt crypto as a legal tender. One of them was El Salvador, and I think African Central Republic.
Central African Republic.
Yeah, it was another one recently. So we're now starting to see some smaller countries adopt it as legal tender. But what does this mean for the world? What can crypto do if we just zoom out for a minute? I mean, I think to me I would sum it up as it's going to create more economic freedom in the world. And economic freedom means good property rights, it means stable currency, it means free trade, the ability to have stable financial infrastructure for anybody in the world if they just have a smartphone and an internet connection, which increasingly even the poorest people in the world have. And economic freedom is a really important thing. It tends to positively correlate with all kinds of things we want in society, not just higher GDP growth, but even higher self-reported happiness and better income for the bottom 10%, better treatment of the environment. And so it's a pretty incredible idea to imagine that this technology got invented with the Bitcoin white paper back in 2008, and suddenly we're creating a new global financial system that has good financial infrastructure and sound money for everybody in the entire world. It's inclusive, it's democratized, it's global, and I just think that's going to be such a net good for the world, and it's growing kind of like what it looked like in the early days of the internet. So my guess is that in 10, 20 years we'll see a substantial portion of global GDP is actually happening in the crypto economy. And just like a substantial portion of GDP is now happening in e-commerce. It's kind of another levered bet on this globalization and internet penetration of more and more of the economy is going to move into this new crypto economy.
Both of you are offering new products and platforms to try to cater to this institutional market. Brian, can you tell us about what you're doing here? What is Bitcoin Spot is just not enough for the institutions, is that?
That's right, yeah. So we have a prime brokerage product that we've launched, and it includes more and more things over time that institutions have asked us for, including ways to earn yield on those assets with things like staking. As I mentioned, we acquired a derivatives exchange that we'll be launching in the future in that direction. A lot of our institutional clients, they're also looking at things like how do they do vendor payments and even payroll in crypto. We actually launched something called Coinbase Payroll recently, which has had a lot of good adoption. And so, yeah, we're seeing people use it not just for treasury management as a hedge against inflation, but as part of this new asset class. And then they're beginning to use it for B2B payments and payroll in a broader sense as well. So I think it's just going to become more and more integrated into various aspects of how institutions operate their company.
You mentioned retail adoption sort of led in this space, and now we've seen, as I mentioned at the beginning, Fidelity's announced they're going to allow customers to put Bitcoin into their 401ks. Do you see this as a positive development?
Well, I agree with Cathie. There could be more clarity. I think there's cause for optimism though as well. And one thing is that in Biden's recent executive order, they did ask various departments of the government in the U.S. to come back and say we need clarity on this industry. But it was very positive to see them also mention that we need to protect the innovation potential of this technology because this represents a huge opportunity where we want to preserve this in the United States. That was really positive. Another really positive thing I've seen is that when I do spend time in DC, I think this is a very bipartisan issue. There's people on both sides of the aisle who are very pro-crypto, and I would even say the majority of people who I meet with in Congress now, 50% or more, are pro-crypto. They believe in this is a net good for society. Yes, it needs to be regulated, but and then it's actually getting harder and harder to meet a true crypto skeptic in DC. I think we still get sometimes the questions about, well, isn't this just used for illicit purposes? Well, no, it turns out that's a tiny fraction of what happens in crypto, and it's actually much more traceable than something like cash. People ask me about, doesn't this just use a lot of electricity and destroy the environment? Well, it does use electricity, but electricity can be generated in a green way or not a green way, and the industry is moving to things like proof of stake, which are even more energy efficient. So there's a lot of education to do, but think about this stat for a minute. About 1 in 5 Americans have now used crypto or tried it in some way, and that number is growing very quickly. That's a massive constituent. It's a massive voting group, right? There's much smaller constituencies in the United States who have changed elections than 20%, and that number will probably be 40%, right, in a few years. And so it's quickly becoming politically very unpopular to be anti-crypto. Everybody who I talk to basically agrees now that this industry is here to stay. The question is, can we regulate it in a thoughtful way? that actually preserves the innovation. We want to have sandbox environments, de minimis thresholds for startups to get off the ground without having to pay $10 million in legal fees. And then as they get bigger, let's come up with a reasonable test. Is it a commodity like Bitcoin or Ethereum? Well, that can be regulated by the CFTC. Is it a security where someone's raising money for their company? Well, then it can be regulated by the SEC. Is it a currency like a stable coin or something? That can be regulated by the Treasury or someone like that. Or is it something totally different we haven't thought of, artwork and metaverse and gaming and NFTs and decentralized identity? Let's probably not regulate those as financial services. That should be something else. And so it kind of reminds me of the early days of the internet. In 1996, they had the Telecommunications Act. And, President Clinton signed that into office. And was it perfect? No, but it did preserve the innovation potential of the internet. That's what we need to do with this industry. It's following a growth curve, much like the early days of the internet in the late 90s.